So you've got this bill that would expand power and embolden the FTC to fine companies like Equifax for these data breaches. Why is that important?
Okay, so you remember last September when Equifax was so careless with its data that more than half of all Americans' data was stolen. And that means your credit card numbers and your social security numbers and your birthday and all that information is out there in the hands of thieves. And here's the part that really clinches about this. Equifax may actually make money off that breach. We had a banking hearing, had the former CEO of Equifax in, and by the time we got through asking about all the credit products that they were selling, turns out Equifax may do okay. Now, Senator Warren and I think that's a really bad idea and doesn't cause Equifax to invest in the kind of security it should. So we're introducing a bill today that says there will be substantial automatic penalties when a credit reporting agency lets your data get stolen, and that there will be payments back to the people whose data were stolen.
And let's look at this. This is an area of enormous vulnerability. I was one of the 143 million Americans who had my data stolen. And in the case of credit reporting agencies, there's not a direct customer relationship. You and I don't sign up for Equifax's services. They take our data without getting our permission. And we've seen a history with other firms in this area. Experian, Prime Choice have had data breaches as well. What I think drove us both over the top in the need for this legislation, they've had virtually no penalty. The stock price took a little hit, but it's basically recovered. And this was, in the case of the Equifax breach, it was a known vulnerability. Yeah. They could have patched that months earlier. Even when they failed to patch, it then took weeks for them to notify consumers. And then to add insult to injury, when they set up a site to try to have consumers come in, by going into that site, you were oftentimes signing away your rights. And that site that was set up had a whole set of vulnerabilities. We went to it again as recently as yesterday, and the Senate servers said, please don't go on this site. It has known vulnerabilities. When you're that sloppy with your data, there's got to be a price to pay, and I think our legislation with strict liability will send that signal across the industry.
I remember covering you both on the Senate Banking Committee during the Target data breach, and it seems like there hasn't been much new regulatory framework that's been created on these data breaches, if it's Sony, if it's Target, Home Depot, OMB. Do you think, I guess, that the private sector needs the same regulatory framework that the government sector does? In the situation of OMB, Social Security numbers were also obtained.
So, I want to point out on this, what we're proposing for the credit reporting agencies is automatic penalties. And what we're not proposing is a whole new regulatory framework around it, because we recognize it's an area that changes very, very rapidly. What we're trying to do is get the right incentives in place for the credit reporting agencies to say, you better protect these data. And there are lots of ways they can do it. For example, they could break the data apart so that if someone did breach, they got a little tiny sliver of data instead of the keys to the kingdom.
But there is the bigger problem. I absolutely believe that we need common, across-the-board data breach legislation. Right now, we're dealing with 48 different state laws. So a company that's in a variety of states, they don't know what kind of timelines there ought to be in terms of reporting. The good news on this is there's nothing partisan about it. There's been a working group of us, Democrats and Republicans. In many ways, it's been down to individual industries, whether you're talking the telecommunications industry or the retail industry or the banking industry, they all want special deals. And at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that the legislation is flexible, but that every industry has to be included in comprehensive data breach legislation.
Senator, you talk about it being bipartisan. Yesterday, President Trump at the White House meeting with a bipartisan group of lawmakers on immigration, on DACA. I know that both of you have been out front on this as well. It looks like there could be a deal on DACA. What are your thoughts on yesterday's meeting?
I hope yesterday's meeting was a sign that the president is willing to move towards a clean reauthorization of the DREAM Act. But remember, we only have this crisis because the president ended a program that was working. 800,000 young people brought here as children. 97% of these young people are either working in the military or in school, productive Americans, and they were proceeding ahead. President arbitrarily entered the program threw enormous chaos into their lives. Now they're saying we have to do legislation, and we're prepared to do that, bipartisan. But the president has actually got to be a participant and a positive participant. Yesterday he was. I just hope and pray he'll continue that way.
Yeah. And also keep in mind the urgency of this moment. Every single day that goes by, some of these young people lose their status. And that means they're subject to ICE deporting them. It means they no longer legally, many of them can work or be in school or be in the military. This is a crisis. And it is a crisis family by family across this country. I talked to young people from Massachusetts. I met with them when they were here in D.C. I meet with them when I'm back in the state. I talk to young people. This is the only home they've ever known. And they've done everything we asked them to do. They came out of the shadows. They've been vetted. They're now working. They're in school. You know, one of the consequences of failing to pass this legislation is we create a whole group of people who are just vulnerable to exploitation. One of the young women that I spoke with talked about the fact that because she does not have legal status, when her boss was making sexual advances toward her, she knew that she had nowhere to go and that he could call immigration on her. Once she was protected by the DREAM Act, she could actually walk away from that job and go get another job. We need to empower these young people.
And the business community clearly has a role to play there. We've seen the
Absolutely.
letters coming in support of DACA. Switching gears quickly on the Russia investigation, of course, your committee, the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, about to release frameworks for also on data breaches for how to protect these upcoming elections. But there's been a lot of talk with fire and fury about the president's fitness for office. What do you make of that, Senator Warner?
Well, let's start with where we're moving forward. 21 states had their electoral systems attempted to be hacked into by the Russians in 2016. The Russians didn't stop on Election Day. And one of my biggest concerns is while DHS is finally moving more aggressively and we're trying to improve the protections around our state electoral systems, the fact that we still don't have someone in the White House, the fact that the president still denies the validity of these attacks that Russia has also promulgated against France and in other nations, concerns now about Russian intervention in the Mexican elections coming up. The fact that the president doesn't acknowledge it means there's not somebody in charge out of the White House providing a whole of government approach, and that makes ourselves vulnerable going into 2018.
Your thoughts on the president's fitness for office?
You know, look, I think the problem is what the president actually does. This is the part that's got me so deeply worried. The president was just part of a Republican tax plan to give away $1.4 trillion to giant corporations and to billionaires and to make America's working families pay for it. Now he has thrown our 800,000 dreamers out and said they are all subject to deportation, and maybe he's willing to negotiate to let them stay. For me, this is about what the president does every single day, and it's not good.
All right, I can't let you go without asking about Oprah Winfrey and president. So what are your thoughts on Oprah potentially running?
Oprah. Okay. Oprah's terrific.
She brings an enormous energy to anything she takes on. But we've also got, a lot of other folks who I think would be great potential candidates. The more, the better.